Welcome back to the blank of Yu Yu Hakusho, a series where we break down the basics of visual storytelling through episodes of the early 90s anime, Yu Yu Hakusho. Today we're looking at episode 4, Requirements for Lovers, which is largely about the relationship between Yusuke and Keiko as observed by Botan and an investigator from the spirit world trying to determine if there's even a point in Yusuke's resurrection. Does anyone even want him to return? Then an arsonist shows up out of nowhere and sets Yusuke's house on fire. It's okay. It's not my favorite episode. It feels like an excuse to speed up the Yusuke tries to earn his resurrection plotline, but then again, the majority of the show isn't this supernatural slice-of-life high school comedy, so getting past it quickly might be for the best. But a just okay episode like this is a good opportunity to talk about one of the most basic and important elements in creating a television show or movie: the edit, the cut between shots. In many ways, the edit is just as important as what's on screen. It's an invisible language that we, the media-consuming masses, have absorbed without realizing it. Now, this is going to be a very editing 101 video, of which there is a good dozen already on YouTube. You may know a lot of this even if you haven't done film studies, but a good bedrock understanding of how editing works can be a foundation for more in-depth analysis later on. Now, when we're talking about editing, we're usually talking about two different things. There's the mechanics of editing, that is the act of cutting shots and splicing them together, and then there's the narrative constructed from that editing, how two shots relate to each other and how that builds and affects the story. On the mechanical side of things, the most basic and common type of edit is the straight cut, an instantaneous switch between one shot and another. You see this cut hundreds, maybe thousands of times in one movie. Well, these visual cuts. One thing to keep in mind is that when you're editing a film, an episode of television, or a YouTube show, you're not just editing video, you're editing sound, and where you cut in the video may not always correspond to where you cut in the sound. To give you an example, here's a scene where Botan is talking to the investigator. We have a cut that brings us from a wider shot of the group to a close-up of Botan's face, but notice that the cut happens mid-word.
Why do you say things you don't mean? You know she only scolds you because she actually cares about you. Sayaka, I've learned not to listen to him most of the time. He's just embarrassed is all.
The cut is in the middle of Botan saying the word time. She completes the word in the next shot. When audio bleeds like this from one shot to another, it's called a split end, of which there are two kinds, the J cut and the L cut, which indicates if the audio is leading into the cut and if the audio is trailing the cut, respectively. In the case of the clip I just showed you, that's an L cut. The audio ends after the video ends. For an example of a J cut, here's a scene where the character is introduced into the scene through their dialogue before we cut to them visually.
Koenma, sir?
Sayaka, I've received your report.
Now, sound mixing and editing is a video all in its own, but the basic reason for split ends is to trick the brain into thinking that these two shots are existing in the same place, even though in reality they were created hours, days, weeks apart. This is especially tricky for any project that gets any of their audio on site, like dialogue in a live action piece. Here's a horribly perfect example for Birdemic. This is a simple scene. A man walks into a restaurant, is greeted by one of the staff, and is brought to his table. Now let's see how you can mess that up.
Hi.
Here is the menu.
Thank you.
I'll be right back with you.
Now, there's a million and one things wrong with this scene, from the script to the acting to the cinematography, but just from an editing perspective, all the audio is contained within each shot, including that awful background hum. So when you make the cut, the volume and quality of that audio changes, oftentimes dramatically, drawing your attention to the cut, pulling you out of the movie. So let's take this scene, get rid of that awful hum, and include a few more sound effects and utilize L and J cuts, and see how much different it makes.
Hi.
Here is the menu.
Thank you.
I'll be right back with you.
Okay, obviously that's not great either. It's not like I have the master tape to work from. And even without the hum, there's no fixing the audio quality in the dialogue. But hopefully, by bleeding the audio into other shots by even just a few frames, and adding a consistent, uncut background noise over all of it, this feels more like a comprehensive scene rather than a distracting series of shots. You can suspend your disbelief just a little bit easier. The next most common edit after the cut is the dissolve, when one shot fades over another. Since this is an edit that draws attention to itself, it's typically not used in the shot-to-shot continuity of a scene, but rather something that separates scenes, usually symbolizing a change. In this episode of Yu Yu Hakusho, there is exactly one dissolve, and it's used to signify the passage between day and night. This is getting into the narrative uses of editing, but dissolves can also disorient, showing us the internal mindset of a character, and it can also draw attention to the similarity of things. Viewers notice a dissolve, and an editor can use that to their advantage. There are other kinds of edits. Star Wars famously uses wipes as scene transitions, but they're not particularly common and usually a stylistic choice. And since we're wading into it, let's get into how editing affects the narrative. After 100+ years of film, there are uses of editing that have stuck and become a regular part of visual media, and we the viewers don't even think about it when they happen. Good example, the eyeline match. When you have a shot of a character looking at something, and whatever the next shot is, we the viewers just assume that's what the characters are looking at.
You've got to watch that tongue, Yusuke.
Who cares? We're alone!
We don't know that for sure. Koenma's probably sending investigators to check on how you're doing.
Investigators? What do they look like?
Now, technically speaking, just from these two shots, this storm could be happening on the opposite side of the world. But since shot 1 ends with two characters looking at something, we the audience assume that the next shot is what they're looking at. If that turned out not to be the case, we would end up disoriented. Maybe that's what the filmmakers are going for, oftentimes not, though you can fudge it. For example, in this shot, Yusuke is looking at this egg in his right hand and then looks to his left. In the next shot, both Botan and the egg are in shot, which is impossible from Yusuke's eyeline. However, it was decided that having the egg in the shot was important. It is the focal point of the scene. And since Yusuke is looking at Botan, just at a slightly different angle, we can forgive this breaking of the rule. Following on from the eyeline match, we have shot reverse shot, which is the usual way conversations are shown in film. There are 1,000,001 ways to film this, but the central trick is to have your two characters facing inwards. Consider this scene where the investigator and Yusuke talk to each other.
Botan, if you would help, which one is Yusuke's girlfriend?
Girlfriend? What are you talking about?
Which of the girls is Keiko?
Not that again!
Both characters are floating in the sky, so there's no useful geography to help the viewer place these characters in relation to each other. But simply the fact that the investigator is looking to the right, while Yusuke is looking to the left, gives us the impression that these two characters are looking at each other. The eyeline match ping-pongs between the two characters. If both characters were facing the same direction, we would assume that one of them was talking to the other's back. Of course, unless you're Dinner with Andre, you're likely to have more than just characters looking at things and talking with each other. Which brings us to cutting on action. Cutting two shots in a way that makes it feel like a continuous action. Here's a scene where the ghostly Botan is trying to get the attention of Kuwabara, so she passes her hand through the boy's back. This clip is 3 shots with 2 edits.
Hey! Listen!
Each of these 3 shots were made separately, possibly by different people at different times, but when timed and edited together correctly, it feels like one single action. What really sells it is the 3rd shot, where we have a few frames of Botan pulling back. A cheaper director might not think creating those animation cells worth it, but having them sells the motion and your brain barely registers the cut. Now, these are all edits that let scenes flow naturally, but sometimes you want a moment of contrast. You want the audience to notice something. If you want them to focus on a smaller detail of a larger scene, you might use what's called an insert, when you cut closer to a certain detail of the previous shot. A common use of that is showing what a person has in their hands. In this scene, Keiko is visiting Yusuke's very filthy apartment and finds a note from Yusuke's mother. We first get a wide shot showing the poor state of the apartment and Keiko's attempts to wade through it all. When she picks up the note, we cut to a close-up of it. This is the insert. This is usually contrasted with a cutaway, which, like the insert, focuses on a detail of a scene, but one that was not established in the previous shot. In this scene, Keiko is approached by a boy in the hall who asks her out. We go from this shot of Yusuke, Botan, and the investigator watching the scene from a distance to this shot of Keiko's legs. Since Keiko isn't in the previous shot, this is a cutaway, meant to bring our attention to this detail, perhaps to show us how uneasy Keiko stands when approached with romantic interest. You may also have noticed that it's an eyeline match. There's a lot of overlap and definition fudging with these ideas. Now there's a lot more that can be done with editing, but not a whole lot more demonstrated with this episode. It is, after all, a short piece of general entertainment that had to be produced quickly. And it's a character piece at that. It doesn't call for more visually flashy or artistically driven edits. Instead, the edits in this episode are mostly utilitarian, useful but not flashy. We will no doubt be returning to the subject of editing multiple times in this series. God, there's 112 episodes. I gotta stretch this stuff out, man. But hopefully these most basic of basics will assist you in editing your own works, or understanding the editing choices in the works of others. At the very least, you're gonna be seeing L and J cuts everywhere for like the next 2 days.